Hi, I'm Warren Sprouse. You're on the Bible Forum. This is Easter Sunday weekend. We've been talking about all sorts of things Easter related. But the Jews are out here too, celebrating Passover. I want to go back to that memorable Passover that is described in the Bible. Dr. Friedrichsen, who is a woman, by the way, is a distinguished visiting professor of comparative religion at the Hebrew University and writes of the Passover when Jesus was crucified. The Passover meal, she says, according to biblical law, had to be eaten in a state of purity. In the days of Jesus, pilgrims, Jesus among them, streamed into the city to undergo a week-long ritual of purification. Only once that was completed, preparations for the sacred meal could begin. The feast of unleavened bread, the matzah, would then continue for another week. Only thereafter would the city begin to empty once the holiday came to a close. And so in the city would be lots of Jews and lots of sheep. Lots of unstructured time punctuated by bouts of ritual purification before the holiday actually began. And in Jesus' period, one more social ingredient went into the mix. There would be lots of Roman soldiers. Galilee, Jesus' native corner of the Jewish homeland, was an independent Jewish state for all of his lifetime. But Judea, with its capital city of Jerusalem, lay under Roman jurisdiction. Rome didn't rule from Jerusalem. The prefect, or governor, in our story Pilate, was garrisoned with some 3,000 soldiers in the beautiful harbor city of Caesarea, Caesar's harbor. 3 times a year during the Jewish pilgrimage holidays, the prefect and his troops marched up to the capital city to help manage the holiday crowds. Now, if you have a picture of the Holy Lands in your mind, a map, you know that Caesarea is north of Jerusalem. And yet here we are told that the prefect would march up to the capital. If you find that strange, you're a stranger to biblical ideas and Jewish ideas. Every road to Jerusalem is up. And not just because the city sits on the highest hill, but because we're going up to Jerusalem. The Roman troops were in Jerusalem to see and to be seen. They maintained order. They kept things moving. And they ensured that no protests erupted, especially on the Temple Mount, for it was during these holidays, holy days, wrote Josephus, that, quote, sedition is most likely to break out, end of quote. It was in this bustling and bursting space, the beating heart of the city during the great festivals, that Jesus taught about the kingdom of God in the week leading up to the feast. Rome's soldiers, alert to any sign of trouble, would have gazed down at Jesus and his listeners from their stations on the perimeter wall that surrounded the temple precinct's sacred space. The fact that Jesus traveled to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, and according to John's Gospel, to observe many other high holidays as well, means that he was actively engaged in worship at the temple. Despite Jesus' repudiation of the many customs of the day, in many gospel stories we see Jesus comfortably at home in the traditions and practices of his people. He wore the fringes, the ritual garment meant to remind the wearer of God's commandments. In one gospel story, a sick woman is cured of her illness by touching them. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus describes for his followers how they should make offerings at the temple altar. Jesus also affirms the traditional Jewish belief that the temple was the place where God dwells. And in all three synoptic gospels, Jesus celebrates the Seder, the ritual Passover meal, with his closest followers. The centerpiece of this meal, the Passover sacrifice, was the lamb itself. There was only one place in town to get a lamb. That was the temple. Finally, one last nice detail. Mark's gospel closes off the Seder scene by commenting that the group all sang hymns. Even today, Jews finish celebrating the Passover meal by singing the psalms of praise and thanksgiving. So far, the description is about any Passover. But the biblical account is when Jesus and his followers were in Jerusalem for the holiday. What made this particular one his last? Think back to the crowds of pilgrims entering no later than the week before the feast, to the Roman soldiers, and consider the effects of Jesus' teaching about the kingdom of God. For first century Jews, the idea of God's kingdom implied sweeping hopes for a glorious end to history. God himself, or in other traditions, the Messiah, a ruler who would be descendant of King David, would defeat the forces of evil and establish a universal reign of justice and peace. Who would these forces of evil be? Rome. War and disease would no longer exist. Pagans would bury their idols and turn to worship Israel's God. The temple would be miraculously enlarged, since, in the words of Isaiah, many nations would flow into it. All 12 tribes of Israel would reassemble, and the dead too, rising to join with the living, would enter into the kingdom. As Jesus and his immediate followers taught of this kingdom as the end-time event inaugurated by God, it might have been heard differently by those outside. Enthusiastic pilgrims, unacquainted with the nonviolent nature of Jesus' teachings, the idea of turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, forgive in order to be forgiven, may have heard it in a summons to political action. Roman agents, always aware of sedition, would be keenly conscious of such an effect. All of the Gospels recount Jesus' growing popularity as he taught on the Temple Mount. The crowd's enthusiasms waxed as the holiday approached. The priests and Pilate together were responsible for keeping the peace. John's Gospel tells of a mixed contingent of Roman soldiers and temple police arresting Jesus off stage, away from the public eye, at night, precisely because he was so popular. By the following day, Jesus was executed as King of the Jews, a political charge that easily mixes with enthusiasms for a kingdom. Jesus died on a cross, a fact that implies Pilate thought he was an insurrectionist. Crucifixion was particularly reserved for rebels. It was a grisly form of deterrence. But none of Jesus' followers was rounded up. None of them were killed along with him. And all that tends to imply that Pilate knew perfectly well that Jesus wasn't politically dangerous. What's more, very shortly after Jesus' execution, his original followers settled permanently in Jerusalem without any anxieties about Pilate or any interference from him. It implies that Pilate knew they were not dangerous. It was the insistence of the religious realm of Judaism that got Jesus killed. The reason Jesus is dying probably lies with the enthused pilgrim crowd. It's an audience that Pilate actually addresses when he puts Jesus on the cross. Crucifixion was a public performance of the coercive power of the Roman state. It was, in short, a form of crowd control. There's an historical note that goes along with this that tells us that after a rebellion broke out in the year 6, for instance, 2,000 men were crucified outside the walls of Jerusalem. Pilate and the priests, according to John's Gospel, had many opportunities to observe Jesus in Jerusalem, where he always taught in the synagogues and in the temple, where all Jews gathered. They knew by now that he posed no political threat, but the restive crowd was a different matter, and the Sanhedrin was worked up. It may have been that Pilate was anxious to settle the issue, quiet the subversive hopes by displaying Messiah, their Messiah, on a cross. In the short run, Pilate was right. The rest of the holiday event evidently passed without incident, but in the long run, Pilate got it all wrong. Thanks to the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, the movement that Pilate had sought to quell would eventually grow to become the sole legitimate religious culture of the empire. What propelled the new movement was the conviction of Jesus' earliest followers that he had been raised from the dead, the origin of Christian celebration of Easter. As the Gospels relate the story, the short gap between Good Friday and Easter Sunday allowed Jesus' Jewish followers to keep the Sabbath before going to his grave. Already within the lifetime of that first generation, we know from Paul's letters that pagans began to renounce their native gods, and through baptism into this new messianic movement to make an exclusive commitment to Israel's God. Over time, these people tipped the movement's demographic balance, and the various Christian churches became dominated by Gentiles. Developing their new religious identities, some of these Christians began to express their theological convictions by sharply and polemically contrasting themselves with Jews and with Judaism. And when Rome destroyed Jerusalem in the year 70 AD, following another Judean rebellion, the temple could no longer serve as a site of common piety. By the second century, Christianity and Judaism were beginning to go their separate ways. But lively connections between the two communities persisted. Church sources reveal that for generations, Gentile Christians frequented Jewish synagogue services, had rabbis bless their fields, participated in the celebration of Jewish fasts and feasts, took oaths in front of Torah scrolls, and kept the Sabbath as a day of rest. When synagogues held fundraisers, Gentiles contributed as well. And for centuries after Jesus' death, Christians continued to celebrate Easter according to the date of the Passover. The Emperor Constantine demanded, ineffectively, that this practice stop. Imperial insistence on the unity of theology and practice, sometimes expressed again through the coercive power of the Roman state, eventually led to the active persecution of other Christians, as well as pagans and Jews. Fissures among these different Christian communities, the Catholics, the Greek Orthodox, the Coptic, the Syrian, Nestorian churches, led to their adopting different dates for the holiday. Today in Jerusalem, Easter falls out over a zone of time, not on a particular date. Despite a long and often unhappy history, the story of Jews and Christians remains intertwined. The bridge between the two is the historical figure of Jesus. This year, whether you celebrate Passover on April 19 or Easter on April 21, you think back to Roman Jerusalem in the days of its beautiful temple, the crowds, the excitement, the mounting joy, the holiday-forged kinship. The trajectory that began there in the temple's court still carries us forward in our own communities, in our own time. Such is the centrality of this personage called Jesus in both the Jewish community and among Christians. We wish each other happy Easter. They wish something different. But we're together around Messiah, who is returning. And believing Jews will be brought in to that family, along with Christians, together. How about you?